Thanks heaps to Matt and to Mess. I've been really lucky to kind of have a week here mucking around with stuff. So I've been working with Modular since for about 10 years, and I became really fascinated by what I saw as kind of unique modular-based ways of composing and structuring music. But most of the conversation that I was seeing in electronic kind of music media was talking about this resurgence of modular synthesizers as being about their analog sound or the wild kind of possibilities for timbre creation, which wasn't like, those things are great, but that wasn't the main thing I took away from using a modular synthesizer. So I started a PhD in 2019, the aim of which is to kind of find out from people that use modular synthesizers what it is about the instruments that they like and how the instruments kind of might impact on how they compose music. So I've interviewed just over 20 people, and I'm kind of in the process at the moment of writing up the results of that. But this talk has come out of the literature search that I've done for the PhD, and a paper that I wrote recently for the journal Organised Sound, which hopefully will come out later this year. The paper focuses on the relationships between modular synthesizers, tape-based music processes circa kind of 1950 to 1965, and the idea of improvising or performing live electronic music. I'm basically making an argument that modular synthesizers, through their historic development and through their historic use and through their contemporary use, have more in common with a DAW, with a digital audio workstation, or a kind of a whole of studio approach to making music than they do with fixed architecture synthesizers. So I'd like to set the scene to begin with by talking a bit about tape music. So the term tape music, as I'm using it, is to refer to music composed using a disc or using tape recorders and performed or played back from fixed recording medium. Electronic music in the post kind of World War II setting was kind of inseparable from tape recording technology. The majority of electronic music produced from 1948 to the advent of synthesizers was all made using these kind of classic tape studio techniques of kind of recording and splicing tape together to kind of create compositions. Tape music's really commonly associated with Pierre Schaeffer and with musique concrète, but the things that were happening around the same time in Germany at WDR studios with Stockhausen and kind of some of the serialist composers that work in electronic music, those composers were equally reliant upon tape music based techniques and splicing tape using kind of oscillators like the one you can see over there. That was kind of pretty much what they had to work with. There was no way of controlling the oscillators externally. You could only kind of turn the dial, and so they'd be recording little chunks and then splicing them together. The theme to Doctor Who was constructed entirely using tape splicing techniques. There was no synthesizers used in it because they essentially didn't exist at the time. It's a really great example of tape music based practice. So the definition of modular synthesizer that I'm working with is an electronic musical instrument having three principal features. One being multiple independent components that can be configured together in a range of ways. The use of a method of voltage control to kind of interconnect those modules. And the machine is for the purposes of creating sound in real time. Both voltage control and that flexible interconnection of discrete modules were already key features of analog computers, which were widely used in the military from the 1940s, particularly in fire control is where they were developed. And then more generalized engineering and scientific applications were using analog computers in the 1950s and 60s. And in fact, they were still used right up until the 80s in some applications. So this image here is of an analog computer from, I think, 1959. It's a portable one. A lot of them were a lot bigger. And you can see that it looks a lot like a modular synthesizer. And in fact, the way they connect together with, in this case, banana plugs between different components to kind of create a system it's almost, it'd be hard to tell the difference between a modular synthesizer and one of these.
You could still use that as a sequencer?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'd love to get my hands on one and have a play with it. So Harold Bode designed and built the first modular synthesizer in 1959, and he published a paper describing his instrument in 1961. Bode is the same Bode that is known for creating the Bode frequency shifter and a ring modulator, which were both available later under Moog license. And Bode also designed the Moog vocoder in the 1970s. So I should just mention that use of voltage control was also used in a musical application by Hugh LeCaine around the same time. But Bode kind of created this instrument that had a ring modulator in it and an envelope shaper, and I think it's really interesting that this is the whole instrument here, and integral to it is a tape recorder that was kind of a part of the machine. And Bode kind of described his synthesizer as offering immediate processing of sounds, and kind of contrasted this immediacy of the instrument to tape music, where you would kind of have to record and splice and then listen back and then kind of think about the changes you want to make those changes and then listen back. Whereas this instrument allowed you to hear what was happening at the same time that you were making those kind of compositional decisions and changing things. He credits analog computing as being the kind of inspiration for the kind of the way it functioned, or its interface. So to me, the integration of a tape loop kind of in the instrument sits somewhat awkwardly with common understandings of what we now think of as a synthesizer, in that we kind of think of synthesizers as being conceptually separate to the devices that you would use to kind of record and manipulate recordings, whereas at this time they were kind of one and the same device conceptually. Robert Moog and Don Buchla are credited with developing the first commercial modular synthesizers, which they did about the same time as each other, between 1963 and 1965. And both of them have made mention of Bode's design and Bode's paper. So I would say that they were both aware of this instrument. So I want to talk a little bit about the San Francisco Tape Music Center. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, interest in improvisation in the kind of composition and performance of electronic music was really building. However, classical tape techniques didn't really kind of lend themselves to real-time performance or improvisation. In 1961, a group of composers, including Pauline Oliveros, Terry Riley, Raymond Sender, and they were later joined by Morton Subotnick, began organising a series of concerts called the Sonics series, which situated improvised music and presentations of tape music together for an audience. So you'd go to a gig and you might see someone kind of improvise in a group, and then you might also kind of listen to a tape piece that's been pre-prepared. And in some cases, pieces were performed where people would improvise with instruments over the top of tape recorders, or there might be multiple tape players that would kind of start and stop. And so they were really interested in taking kind of the electronic music that they were listening to and creating in those possibilities, but they also really wanted to make it into something that was live, because they were really interested in improvisation as well. But that did form a sort of a contradiction for them that they set out to resolve. Pauline Oliveros developed techniques that allowed her to perform in real time with a reel-to-reel tape machine and a test oscillator, which enabled her to hear the music as she was making it, which is something that she was a big fan of and has kind of written various articles about listening as such a key part of creating music or performing. And Oliveros also organised Tudor Fest in 1964, which was a festival named for David Tudor, and featured him as a performer and composer, and was focused on live performance of electronic music. David Tudor at the time was creating his own kind of instruments and circuits that he would be able to perform in kind of real time with. And similarly, Ramon Sender was also exploring kind of possibilities for improvising in relation to tape music, and he was experimenting with a Chamberlin instrument, which was a keyboard instrument that used multiple strips of magnetic tape and reed heads to kind of reproduce pre-recorded sounds, kind of like a predecessor of the Mellotrons that it kind of reissued out there. Sender had hoped to achieve playback of custom tapes and to enable music concrete techniques to be undertaken in real time, which is why he was working towards that. So these motivations that they had around bringing electronic music into a live, kind of improvised space led them to eventually engage Donald Buchla and Ramon Sender and Morton Subotnick kind of worked with him to develop a new electronic music for the Tape Music Centre. So Donald Buchla had actually made his own compositions with tape before that, so he wasn't just kind of an engineer who was being asked to build this abstract thing. He loved electronic music himself and was wanting to make music himself, and so he's kind of the perfect person for the job, I guess. So the primary design kind of driver for the Buchla music box, which later became the Buchla 100, was a means to reduce the labour involved in slicing tape and enable real-time improvisation of electronic music. The Buchla music box delivered in 1965 included 3 separate sequencing modules, each with as many as 16 steps, which represented the possibility of the equivalent of 16 slices of tape to be made very quickly, and that's how they kind of thought about the sequencer, as a means to quickly make those edits. And the Buchla also included a 10-note kind of pressure-based or skin contact area keyboard, and it's commonly assumed that it has kind of 10 plates on it because people often have 10 fingers, but that's not actually the case. The 10 outputs and the 10 plates were specifically designed to enable the dynamic control of 10 Viking tape loop decks, which they happen to have at the Tape Music Centre. So tape loop decks were kind of like a tape cartridge, which kind of came about in the 70s, but the tape loop decks were used in radio stations as a way to kind of quickly play back advertisements or kind of short spots and things.
Like cart machines.
Yeah, they were cart machine, yeah. So I think that's really interesting that the first Buchla synthesizer was really designed about having this close integration with tape kind of machines.
Just a question about when they're laying the tape up on the backing. Are they cutting the tape, longer than each of the steps, and then layering them? So
when they're editing tape?
Yeah, onto the like, so you splicing it onto a backing like on the BBC machine, or taping it together. Are they letting it overlap so it's becoming thicker, and then you're getting like some of the sound from the previous sample while the other one starts?
No, you
butting it up.
You normally, you cut it sideways on an angle, and that actually creates a fade between the two sounds.
Okay.
And so that kind of, you kind of see it when you're working with Pro Tools, like that same paradigm has made its way into software. But real-time interaction and performance is also a priority for the earliest Buchla designs, which included components such as the Model 112, which incorporated touch plates to translate pressure into voltage levels and select preset voltage stages, and the Model 114, which also used touch plates to generate gate signals and distribute control voltage. So that was Buchla's kind of connections to tape practice, but in the case of Moog as well, was similarly linked to tape-based practices, and it was through an encounter with the composer Herb Deutsch that initiated the process of designing and prototyping what was to become the first Moog synthesizer. Deutsch wanted a portable electronic music studio, and he worked with Moog to kind of bring about the early stages of that design, I suppose. Deutsch was also interested in kind of seeking a more dynamic and direct relationship with electronic music making than the classical tape studio techniques allowed. I think it's interesting that that Moog kind of ADSR envelope actually came about through a commission from the composer Vladimir Ussachevsky, who didn't want it to be part of a synthesizer at all, but just wanted it to be a standalone envelope generator that he would use to create fades in tapes as he was kind of composing with tape. So another kind of thing that was happening around the same time as tape music and this growing interest in improvisation was also an interest in using indeterminacy as a part of kind of compositional processes. So having some factors in a composition or in a performance that were somewhat chance-based. So the composers that were based at the San Francisco Tape Music Center were experimenting with various kind of methods of using indeterminacy in both composition and performance, and they presented performances and recorded works by both John Cage and David Tudor, who were working with indeterminacy a lot. Similar to improvisation, indeterminate approaches to composition raised issues for tape-based music practices. Cage wanted to decouple performance from composition through chance operations so that a composition would exist, and then whenever it was performed it would be different due to the kind of chance operations in the composition. But obviously you can't do that with tape, because once it's on tape it then doesn't change. It's kind of set in place, and so that created a kind of an issue for how do you incorporate indeterminacy and electronic music when electronic music is just tape-based studio practices. So given the keen interest in the work of Cage and Tudor and indeterminacy more broadly at the San Francisco Tape Music Center, it's no surprise that the first Buchla design included this kind of dual random voltage source in it, which was basically a pair of sample and hold circuits, each combined with a noise source. Buchla kind of continued to develop these concepts further in 1969 with the Model 265 source of uncertainty, and later the Model 266, which incorporated shift register style circuits offering a range of randomized and slewed voltage outputs. And you can see, like in a relatively contemporary module like the Make Noise Woggle Bug, very similar design is kind of carried through from there. But by situating kind of the possibility of chance operations within the device itself, the Buchla enabled indeterminate compositional approaches through patching to be embedded in the instrument itself, so that when you were performing with it live or improvising with it, you would be kind of operating with and against these kind of random things that are also happening in the patch in a real-time context. So through the 60s, as these kind of both the Buchla and the Moog continued to develop, there were competing kind of ideas about what these instruments were and what they were kind of for and how they should be kind of considered, I guess. So Moog was in contact with and consulted with a range of musicians and composers as he was developing the Moog further. Some of them, like Herb Deutsch, Walter Sear, Eric Sade, Wendy Carlos, really encouraged Moog to develop a dedicated keyboard interface and to kind of standardize that as part of the system that he would sell to people. But there were other people that were working really closely with Moog as well, including Vladimir Usuchevsky and Moog's own employee, John Weiss, who kind of was responsible for a lot of the sales of the early sales of Moog instruments, really opposed the inclusion of a keyboard because they felt like that would limit the possibilities of this new instrument and kind of make people see it as a piano or an organ or whatever, just a normal instrument that was to be played rather than something kind of with broader possibilities, I guess. In the case of the Buchla, Ramon Sender was actually arguing for the inclusion of a keyboard as the primary interface, but both Subotnick and Buchla opposed the inclusion of a traditional keyboard, at least. So Subotnick and Buchla did agree that the instrument was a means to kind of break away from existing forms and processes of music, but they were not on the same page regarding more nuanced intentions of the Buchla. Buchla was concerned with its potential as a performative kind of instrument, and you can see that he then went on to design a range of kind of MIDI controllers in the 80s and 90s that were kind of quite innovative. He was very interested in the interface kind of side of things and the idea of an instrument that you would perform with. Whereas Subotnick, on the other hand, viewed the Buchla instrument as a studio tool that interacted directly with tape. So here he says that the process had to be that of a studio artist, not of a musician playing an instrument and recording and overdubbing and things like that. It had to be a process that went directly onto the tape, and so in some way the tape was the medium and the record players were the reproduction. Subotnick was really interested in Marshall McLuhan's idea of the medium as the message. And at the same time that these synthesizers were coming out, the LP format was actually quite new as well, as a kind of a stereo kind of playback, reasonably high fidelity that you could have in your home. And Buchla kind of saw the record as being the natural place that a synthesizer would kind of be heard and performed via a record player. But by the end of the 60s, modular synthesizers and their fixed architecture descendants became popularly associated with keyboards as their primary interface due to a range of factors, including the commercial viability of the keyboard as an easily understood interface, and also Wendy Carlos's album Switched on Bach kind of really shifted the popular view of what a synthesizer was. In the 1970s, modular synthesizers started to fall into decline due to the introduction of smaller, less expensive instruments such as the Minimoog D and the ARP Odyssey. These new instruments largely retained the kind of sound generating properties of the larger modular synthesizers, but they lost a lot of the possibilities for generating and manipulating musical structure that the larger modular instruments had. So after the first Buchla was built, Morton Subotnick then moved to New York as an artist in residence for New York University. And part of the deal he made with them was that they would buy him a Buchla synthesizer. So the second Buchla built travelled with him to New York, and he specified what that instrument would consist of. He then spent 13 months recording, composing and recording Silver Apples of the Moon, which was released in 1967 on None Such Records. Kind of arguably the first kind of modular kind of based recording to be commercially released. To create the record, he was working with multiple sequencing modules, two that had up to 16 stages and another one with 8 stages. And each step on these sequences was able to control 3 parameters. In the process of designing the Buchla instrument, they decided that 3 parameters was pretty much what you needed, because this would allow for one parameter to control the timing, and another to control the pitch, and another control the volume for each step. But later on, Subotnick regretted this decision as he realised that he'd like to also control various aspects of timbre in this way. It was this realisation that made him bring the instrument to New York that had kind of multiple sequences in it. Subotnick describes a process of adding voltage outputs with the sequencing modules kind of running at odd lengths to each other, such as 15 stages on one and 11 stages on another one. And so in that way, as they're running together, they would fall out of sync and their voltages were being added together, and you'd get these very long sequences that would take a long time to kind of repeat. So I was able to interview Morton Subotnick late last year, which was really exciting. And this is something he told me about the process of recording Silver Apples. He said that I'll do my best to kind of render this. So I would take whatever I wanted to do, like a ta-dee-dum, and when I got to the D of the ta-dee-dum, I would wiggle a little thing, it would go ta-dee-dum, ta-dee-dum, or put FM to it and put my finger, and the amount of pressure would be the amplitude of it. So ta-dee-dum, a pre-dum, so I was just playing and just recording them. I like this quote because it demonstrates the importance of improvised creation of musical phrases as structural elements, both for the design of the Buchla and also for Subotnick's intentions as a composer. The possibilities for real-time improvised interaction with the instrument integrated with the musical structure, kind of building aspects of the instrument, such as the sequences, were really central to Subotnick's account of his compositional process and the genesis of the Buchla synthesizer. This is just a couple of the modules that we've been talking about. So the timing generator on the right can be voltage controlled in terms of, like, it basically will send out a trigger at a regular interval. But by using one row from this sequencer here to control the speed of the timing generator, it actually wasn't designed to kind of run at a kind of a stable kind of quantized regular set of intervals. It was designed to kind of be able to place musical events kind of in time as you liked, basically. And I think that's really interesting because the way sequences evolved to be kind of used in their kind of standard way in most electronic kind of instruments is that there is this fixed interval between steps. And yeah, I just think it's really interesting that essentially the first sequences didn't have that in mind at all. So I'll talk a little bit about my own practice briefly as another example of kind of composing with a modular instrument. I've been focused on using the modular synthesizer as a way of creating MIDI information to control other kind of fixed architecture instruments rather than kind of producing sounds from the modular synthesizer itself. And that's a deliberate strategy that I've been using to try and keep me focused on the creation of musical structure with the instrument rather than kind of getting distracted by the seemingly infinite possibilities for timbre generation from the modular. And yeah, so last year the Australian experimental music label Room 40 released an album that I created through recordings of a MIDI controllable acoustic piano. And I guess it's a pretty good example of the ideas I've been pursuing. Let's play a little bit of this. So the patch used to create Tranductions, which is the album, causes kind of subtle variations to result in potentially drastic shifts in rhythm, melody, and dynamics. I don't use any random voltage sources. So while the outcomes of the system, due to its complexity, were kind of unpredictable and chaotic, once a change had occurred, it would kind of settle into a sort of stability, and I could kind of come back to motives to some degree. I was attracted to the process that I used to create Tranductions because I was continually surprised by the outcomes that I was getting from the system, discovering melodic and dynamic structures rather than undertaking a process of kind of preconceiving ideas and then kind of deliberately specifying them to the system or the software or whatever. While the system was unpredictable, I was able to refine and limit it via both patching and performing, kind of steering the system to aesthetic outcomes that I found pleasing. So the desire to improvise in real time with musical structure, generating and manipulating sections of sound, I think was a key driver and design consideration of the earliest modular synthesizer designs. The contemporary resurgence of interest in modular synthesizers over the past 10, 15 years, whatever, has widened the use of these approaches to electronic music performance and composition. Given the role of modular synthesizers in the historic development of electronic music, in that they went on to become fixed architecture keyboards, and then from there we've ended up with software synthesizers and other things, you can kind of trace it all back to modular synthesizers, I think. So given their role in the development of electronic music, I think this resurgence of interest in modular synthesizers represents a return to the original conceptions of what a synthesizer might do, and more generally a shift in the role electronic music tools play in the creation of music. While contemporary music-making tools such as digital audio workstations and step-based sequencers have brought a lot of convenience to the processes of constructing music, it could be argued that they have also imposed a sort of conservative, grid-based approach to the creation of musical structure. And you can hear that with a lot of electronic music. Everything changes after 4 kind of sections or whatever. So I think that the modular synthesizer resurgence shifts the possibility of electronic music towards real-time performative processes that kind of can fluidly generate and arrange structure at various scales of music composition, and this unique musical affordance goes some way to explain the renewed popularity of these instruments. I've sought to emphasise this aspect of modular synthesizers today because I think that it challenges the normalised and popular understandings of what a synthesizer does and why they are valued, alongside attributes commonly assigned to synthesizers such as analog warmth, complex timbres and innovative control interfaces. That real-time synthesis and co-creation of musical structure I think is a key characteristic of modular synthesizers. The contemporary resurgence of modular synthesizers draws our attention to the real-time creation of musical structure in electronic music, and perhaps should be considered a key aspect in the design of new electronic instruments, whether they be modular, fixed architecture, hardware or software. Thanks.